Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a really complex and constantly shifting topic, the Russia-Ukraine war. You've given us quite a stack of sources, everything from, the very latest updates to deep historical context and geopolitical analysis.
Yeah, that's a lot to sift through.
It is. So our mission today is to unpack these, find the really important insights, and hopefully give you a shortcut to being well-informed on what's happening.
Absolutely.
We'll look at the latest developments, trace its origins, understand the shifting battlefield, and examine those bigger international ripples.
That's right. And what's really illuminating, I think, in these sources isn't just the sequence of events, the timeline,
Right.
but how all these different perspectives and strategic moves, they kind of weave together this incredibly complex story.
Yeah.
So we'll try to synthesize these different viewpoints, help you connect the dots, and understand not just what's happening, but maybe get a sense of the why behind it all.
Yeah.
Should be some surprising details in here, hopefully leading to a clearer picture, even with all the complexity.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Let's unpack the very latest from these sources, taking us right up to, June 2025.
June 2025.
And it's clear military actions have really intensified. So on June 3rd, we have Ukraine's security service, the SBU, carrying out this major underwater sabotage.
On the Kerch Bridge again?
On the Kerch Bridge, exactly. And this wasn't minor. We're talking about planting and detonating over a ton of explosives.
Wow.
Yeah, damaging the underwater pillar significantly. This bridge, it's 19 kilometers?
Yeah, it's massive. And critical for their supply lines.
Absolutely vital. And this is the third major attack on it since October 2022, which really highlights, its strategic importance hasn't faded.
Not at all. And that Kerch Bridge attack, it wasn't really an isolated incident around that time, was it? There's a pattern here of Ukraine projecting power.
You're absolutely right. Just a couple of days before that, June 1st, Ukraine conducted something pretty extraordinary called Operation Spider's Web.
Okay, tell us about that.
So this was a simultaneous drone attack, not just one spot, but 5 Russian air bases.
5. Whereabouts?
Well, that's the thing. Regions as far apart as Siberia and Murmansk, way deep inside Russia.
Deep strikes. How did they manage that?
Apparently, they used 117 FPV drones. These are those first-person view, sort of kamikaze-style drones.
Right, the precise ones.
Exactly. And they reportedly hid them inside refurbished trucks to get them close.
Clever. And the damage.
The reports claim over 40 Russian military aircraft were destroyed or damaged, specifically strategic bombers, the Tu-95s and Tu-22s.
Oh, those are high-value assets.
Very high value. The estimated damage is pegged at around $7 billion.
$7 billion. Wow.
Yeah. And it apparently briefly limited Russia's long-range strike capabilities. It's a huge statement, right? Pushing that deep into Russian airspace, forcing them to rethink defenses.
Definitely a strategic message.
Yeah.
And Russia's response. Predictably harsh, I imagine.
Yeah, predictable and harsh. Russia escalated its own attacks, drone and missile strikes across Ukraine. Our sources mention these devastating aerial bombings near Zaporizhia, 5 civilians killed there.
Sure.
And drone attacks in the Sumy district wounded at least 6 people, including kids.
So it's this intense cycle of escalation, which brings up the question. Amidst all this fighting, is there any room for diplomacy? What do the sources say about peace efforts?
It's a really important question, and surprisingly, the answer isn't a flat no.
Yeah.
Despite the heightened hostilities, Russian and Ukrainian envoys actually met.
They met where?
In Istanbul on June 2nd, it was their second round of direct peace talks since 2022.
That's unexpected given the context, what was on the table.
Well, Ukraine put forward a blueprint. It called for an initial 30-day ceasefire,
Okay.
an exchange of prisoners, and interestingly, a summit between Presidents Zelensky and Putin.
A face-to-face summit. That's ambitious.
Very. But unsurprisingly, the major sticking points remain. Things like territorial concessions, reparations.
Really hard stuff.
Exactly. So there are significant doubts about whether an immediate solution is even possible right now.
And internationally, how's this being viewed?
A lot of skepticism. The sources mention U.S. senators, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, for example.
Right.
They speculated that, maybe Putin is just dragging out negotiations to buy time for more military attacks.
Using talks as cover, potentially.
That's the concern. And they stress the need for tight sanctions on any country is still propping up Russia's war economy. It just shows how hard it is to negotiate when the fighting is this intense.
Absolutely. The trust deficit must be enormous.
Immense. So, okay, we've seen the very latest flurry of activity, but how did we actually get to this point? Let's rewind a bit.
Yeah, let's trace it back. Way before 2022, right?
Exactly, way before. The sources trace the start of this conflict all the way back to February 2014.
With Crimea.
With Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. And then, almost immediately, Russia started supporting pro-Russian separatists in the Donbas region, eastern Ukraine.
Oh.
That conflict expanded in April 2014. Russians and local proxy forces seized territory there.
And declared those people's republics.
Right. The armed Russian-backed separatists declared the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. And this wasn't a minor skirmish even then. From 2014 onwards, the UN reported over 14,000 casualties.
14,000. Even before the full-scale invasion. It really puts things in perspective.
It does.
And that simmering conflict, that really set the stage, didn't it? For February 24, 2022.
The day everything changed.
Yeah, when President Putin launched the full-scale invasion, the sources say he was reportedly expecting a pretty quick victory.
That was the prevailing wisdom, wasn't it? Even in the West.
It seemed to be. Western countries, the U.S. included, initially seemed to anticipate Ukraine falling quickly. They even evacuated embassies from Kyiv.
I remember that.
But Ukraine's resistance, it was completely unexpected, bolstered, crucially, by U.S.-supplied weapons. That stopped the quick Russian victory they might have hoped for.
Right. And that led to the Biden administration's strategy.
Which was kind of two-pronged, based on the sources.
Yes.
First, hit Russia with sanctions to try and cripple its war economy. And second, provide massive military aid to Ukraine so they could actually fight back.
And that initial resistance, combined with the aid, it did lead to some significant Russian setbacks early on in 2022.
It did. The sources point to Russia withdrawing from Kharkiv Oblast in the northeast by September 2022.
A major pullback.
And then by November 2022, pulling back from Kherson City and parts of Mykolaiv down in the south.
So facing these reversals, how did Russia adapt? What was their strategic countermove, according to the sources?
Oh, Russia definitely shifted gears. A few key things stand out. First, they formally annexed 4 Ukrainian oblasts, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, even though they didn't fully control them.
Right, the paper annexation.
Yeah. Then, a partial mobilization of troops, signaling they were digging in for a long war, not a quick operation.
Preparing for the long haul.
Exactly. And critically, an economic pivot, turning towards Asia, particularly China and India, to find new markets and try to bypass those Western sanctions.
Okay, so a clear signal of resilience and a long-term commitment.
That seems to be the message they wanted to send.
Right. This brings us into that period of the evolving battlefield, sort of 2023 through to early 2025. And what's really striking here is how the momentum seemed to shift back and forth, leading to a much more entrenched conflict.
Definitely entrenched. After those setbacks in 2022, Russia started to regain ground in 2023. The sources mentioned key captures like Soledar in January.
Right.
And then the really brutal fight for Bakhmut, which they took in May 2023.
A symbolic and costly victory.
Very. Then, Ukraine launched its own counteroffensive in June 2023, using those advanced Western weapons we talked about.
High hopes for that one.
There were high hopes, but crucially, the sources say it failed to break through Russia's very strong, well-prepared defensive lines.
That was a major turning point, wasn't it?
It seems to have been, because after that, through 2024, Russian forces continued making gains. They captured Avdiivka in February 2024.
Which was strategically important.
Yes, very important for logistics and as a gateway, according to the analysis. Then Krasnohorivka in September, Vuhledar in October. Small gains, but steady.
Grinding progress.
Grinding is the word. And that continued into early 2025, with reports of seizing Velika Novosilka, parts of Toretsk, and even attempts to encircle Pokrovsk. It paints a picture of slow, methodical Russian advances on the Eastern Front.
But here's where it gets really interesting, right? That constant back and forth, the emergence of new tactics. In August 2024, Ukraine pulls off that surprise attack.
In Russia's Kursk region, yeah, that was unexpected.
Totally unexpected. They captured about 1,000 square kilometers inside Russia. The aim, presumably, was to disrupt Russia, draw troops away from the east.
Put pressure on them, yeah. But how did Russia react to that incursion deep into its own territory? What did the sources say?
Well, this is what's quite telling. The sources suggest that Russia's counteroffensive effectively ignored the Kursk situation.
Ignored it, really?
Largely, yes. They seem to stay focused on exploiting Ukraine's weaknesses in the east instead of diverting major forces to Kursk.
That's a significant strategic choice.
It is. And by the end of 2024, the sources tally Russia capturing a total of over 4,000 square kilometers combined in both Ukraine and that slice of the Kursk region.
So despite the Kursk raid, the overall trend favored Russia on the ground during that period.
That seems to be the assessment. And Ukraine's strategy in 2025, as we saw with Operation Spider's Web, has increasingly involved these deep drone and missile strikes inside Russia and targeting the Black Sea Fleet.
Trying to inflict costs and disrupt logistics far from the front line.
Exactly. But even with these innovative asymmetric attacks, the sources acknowledge that militarily on the main fronts, Ukraine has remained largely on the back foot for, well, over 2 years now.
Which raises the huge question. What does this all mean for the bigger picture, the international players, and most importantly for Ukraine itself?
Yeah, let's get into that. Our sources lay out some really striking differences in perspective, particularly between Europe and the U.S.
Let's start maybe with how they initially reacted and the kind of military support they offered.
Good place. So initially, Europe supported Ukraine, obviously, but the sources highlight a real hesitancy about escalation.
Driven by economic fears.
Largely, yeah, especially that dependence on Russian energy. The U.S., though, went in pretty quickly with that two-pronged approach we mentioned, sanctions and massive military aid.
Right, and in terms of the aid itself?
European countries did provide aid, absolutely. But the sources suggest they lack the capacity for sustained, truly independent, long-term support on the scale needed.
So the U.S. really filled that gap.
Massively stepped in with advanced weapons systems, critical intelligence, huge amounts of financial assistance, became the primary military lifeline, really.
And the economic costs hit very differently, too, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Europe got hit hard. Losing Russian gas, plus the whole Nord Stream pipeline sabotage issue.
Huge impact.
Huge. Led to a widespread cost of living crisis, even fears of deindustrialization in some key sectors. The U.S. economy, on the other hand, was much more insulated.
Which allowed Washington to sustain that high level of military aid without the same kind of domestic economic pain.
Exactly. That economic divergence really shaped their ongoing roles and maybe their strategic thinking.
Okay, what about one of the thorniest issues? NATO membership for Ukraine. Big differences there over time.
Huge differences.
Yeah.
And a complex history. Europe, remember, was hesitant way back in 2008. France and Germany famously opposed offering Ukraine a membership action plan then.
Right, I remember that Bucharest summit.
Now, the sources say Europe wants security guarantees for Ukraine, but there's still no real consensus on full membership. It's complicated.
And the U.S. stance.
The U.S. initially supported it, publicly at least, but then, under former President Trump, the sources claim that stance was basically abandoned.
A major policy shift.
Yeah, reportedly ruling out not just membership, but even specific security guarantees. That shift apparently caught Europe completely off guard.
So, how did these differing security outlooks and long-term goals play out? Europe's obviously worried about Russia next door.
Very worried about Russian expansionism, given their proximity. But the sources point out a key problem. Europe lacks a truly unified defense strategy, especially without strong U.S. leadership within NATO.
Still very reliant on the U.S. under the NATO umbrella.
Largely, yes. The U.S., meanwhile, seems to be prioritizing a broader strategic shift. The analysis suggests Washington increasingly sees China as the bigger long-term challenge, more so than Russia.
Which might explain that reported shift under Trump, trying to potentially realign with Russia to focus on China.
That's one interpretation presented in the sources, a focus on great power politics, maybe over Ukraine's specific immediate interest. Europe was left scrambling to figure out its own role.
So Europe's long-term goal is deterrence against Russia, but they maybe lack the independent military clout.
That seems to be the assessment. While the U.S. aims, perhaps, to reconfigure its global strategy, maybe by ending the Ukraine war in a controlled way and preventing a deeper China-Russia alliance.
And the challenges each side faces now.
For Europe, it's dealing with that economic downturn, the rise of far-right political movements in several countries, and this deep uncertainty about NATO's future if U.S. leadership wavers.
Big structural issues.
Huge. For the U.S., it's this very delicate balancing act. managing relations with both Russia and China simultaneously while trying to engineer some kind of exit from the Ukraine war that doesn't create even more instability.
A really complex geopolitical puzzle.
Absolutely. So, with all these big power dynamics swirling around, how do our sources actually describe Ukraine's current reality? It sounds bleak.
It does. The analysis we reviewed paints a very stark picture for Ukraine. It basically argues that with a potential U.S. withdrawal of major support, a Ukrainian military victory is seen as nearly impossible.
Wow, that's blunt.
It is. The sources list the devastating losses. Over 20% of its territory gone, tens of thousands of soldiers killed, millions of people displaced, either internally or as refugees.
The human cost is just staggering.
Unimaginable. And then there's the economy infrastructure, the energy sector severely damaged, heavy dependence on external military supplies, and critically, a growing manpower shortage on the battlefield.
Running out of soldiers.
That's a major concern highlighted. And on top of that, no firm NATO membership or concrete security guarantees on the horizon.
So what are the options then, according to this analysis?
The sources suggest there are really no good options left for Kyiv. Continuing the war risks losing even more territory and lives. But stopping the war likely means accepting a deal largely dictated by Russia and potentially the U.S. based on their own interests.
Caught between a rock and a hard place doesn't even begin to cover it.
Not really. And what's truly poignant, I think, is the final analysis offered in these sources. It serves as this stark reminder about how international relations often work.
What's the conclusion there?
The conclusion presented is that great powers often use proxy wars to advance their own strategic interests.
Right.
And then, when those interests shift or along differently, they tend to reset ties, sometimes leaving the proxy state in a very difficult position.
So Ukraine is portrayed as the casualty of these larger power games.
In this particular analysis, yes. It concludes Ukraine is left with no good options, serving as a sobering illustration of how proxy actors can suffer when global power dynamics shift.
Wow, what a deep dive this has really been. And we've gone from, specific drone strikes and bridge attacks just last month.
Right, the very current events.
All the way back to the origins in 2014 through all the shifting strategies, the battlefield changes, and the truly heartbreaking human cost. And then layering on top these vastly different perspectives and challenges for Europe and the US, and ending with this really grim assessment of Ukraine's situation from the sources we looked at. It's a lot to process.
It really underscores, doesn't it, that this is so much more than just a localized conflict. It's a reflection of these huge global power dynamics.
Absolutely.
That complex interplay of military force, economic pressure, diplomacy, or the lack of it. Understanding that detailed timeline, but also the contrasting interests of the major players, that helps you see the why behind the what's.
Yeah, definitely. And for you, our listener, hopefully the takeaway isn't just, a list of dates and battles, but a better understanding of all the layers involved in this ongoing human drama. Maybe what stands out to you is the sheer scale of those drone attacks, or the political maneuvering behind the peace talks, or just the enormity of the humanitarian crisis that continues.
Lots to think about.
For sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to consider, a provocative thought building on this. If major powers do, as the sources suggest, reconfigure alliances and strategic interests after proxy wars,
Right.
what might be the lasting geopolitical shifts we should anticipate from this conflict? How could it fundamentally redraw the map of global influence far beyond just Ukraine and Russia?